Salvete, guys. I hope everyone had a good Thanksgiving break and we're back to normal. To go along with our assignment for this week, I want to read to you guys an excerpt from a book called Gladiator, hard to see, by Ben Hubbard, about the most famous style of gladiator that we've talked about called the Retiarius, or the net fighter. That's this guy. He's got the armband and then the trident. As we've talked about, not all the gladiators were the same, and so let's find out what makes him the most unique. The Retiarius fought with a net and is the most easily identifiable Roman gladiator. He was not equipped with a shield or helmet, but wore a galaris, a metal guard, on one shoulder and carried a trident and a short dagger. So you can kind of see those in the picture. The dagger, I think, is supposed to be on this side. The Retiarius was not introduced to the arena until sometime after the middle of the 1st century. He did not share the warrior origins of some of his colleagues. Although clearly inspired by the ocean, there's actually little information about how the Retiarius came into being. However, after being introduced into the arena, he was to be a mainstay of the games all the way until they stopped having them. The introduction of the net fighter heralded a new period in the history of the games, where differently armed fighters, instead of those more closely matched, were paired. Before, one heavily armed fighter like a Murmillo, that was this one, or this is a secutor, but also heavily armed, would fight a similarly weighty adversary such as a Hoplomachus. But after the 1st century, a Murmillo might just as well meet a Retiarius in the arena. This provided a more unpredictable fight. He doesn't have very much armor. He does. They didn't know what was going to happen. Being light and agile was a Retiarius's best defense against the heavily armed opponents. One leg was protected by wrappings and covered with a greave. That's down here. The manica on a Retiarius's arm reached up to the shoulder, which was then covered by the galaris. The galaris was made from a piece of sheet bronze that wrapped around his bicep and then angled outward towards the shoulder. This allowed for the most movement. It enabled the Retiarius to bend his head behind the galaris as well and use it as a shield. Retiarii from the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire sometimes favored a manica that was made of chainmail instead of a galaris, which also covered part of their chest. It is an odd quirk that in many depictions, the Retiarius is not usually shown with his net in ancient Roman mosaics and artwork. This could have been because the artists found it much too difficult to represent. A Retiarius's net would have followed a standard pattern of large mesh holes at the center to trap the opponent and smaller holes at the outer edges to snag the weapons that the opponent was carrying. Smaller holes at the edges would have given the net enough weight to stay open when it was thrown, but weights in the ends may have also been used. With a diameter of around 10 feet, a Retiarius's net probably weighed between 4 and 7 pounds. It was designed for throwing and was something of a one-shot weapon for this reason. If thrown unsuccessfully, a Retiarius would have to rely on his other weapons, a trident or a dagger. The trident was the Retiarius's main weapon, and it reached to around 6 feet high usually. The 3 prongs were used to stab at the opponent, but also to pull away his weaponry and his armor. The prongs were not strong enough to pierce the metal armor of, say, this guy, and so they would often be used to try and get the armor to fall off. A Retiarius's 3rd weapon was the straight-bladed dagger, known as a pugio, very small. This was usually a weapon of last resort, as it was never in the interest of the lightly armed Retiarius to be close enough to his opponent to fight with the short blade. Often, the pugio would be used to dispatch an adversary who had already lost his weapon or was laying on the ground. But the Retiarius's fate often depended on how he fared with his net. A good first throw could bind up his opponent, and sometimes fights would end within seconds of starting. However, once it was thrown, the net was very difficult to retrieve. It also left the Retiarius without armor and only a trident and a dagger to fight his opponent. As so much of his fighting hinged on how to use the net, the Retiarius would spend a great deal of time in the ludus learning how to throw it. The best technique to do so was to hold the folded net in one hand and cast it with an underarm action. I imagine kind of like the way you would throw a frisbee to get the net to spin out, and then that gives the best chance for the enemy to be caught up in it. This required a particular snap of the wrist so that the net would take off in a circular motion, like you're throwing a frisbee. The spinning movement ensured the net would stay open in flight and wrap around whoever it landed against. A throw from around 2 meters would give the net its widest opening spot, but sources also show that the Retiarii would occasionally throw their net from close corners and hold on to one corner to be able to retrieve it more easily. Once separated from his net, the Retiarius' best chance of overcoming his opponent was to use his trident. He could use it to stab at the opponent's legs or body, but sometimes he would also use it as a way of like tripping him up. The final use, once his rival was down, the Retiarius could use his pugio to try and finish the fight. Sounds pretty brutal, huh, guys? Well, thanks for watching, guys. I hope this gives you some more insight into the different styles of gladiators and the different ways that they could dress and fight each other. Please complete your assignment on Google Forms and submit it, and have a great week.